Live. Hey everyone, and welcome to our live stream. Today we are talking all about the business case for AI ethics. I'm your host for today's conversation, which we hope is filled with your comments and questions that you may have. I'm the founder of All Tech is Human. All Tech is Human is an organization that is committed to growing the responsible tech pipeline. If that's of interest to you, get involved with us. Reach out at alltechishuman.org. Send us an email at hello@alltechishuman.org. Really thrilled to have our guests here today. We have Alayna Kennedy and also William Griffin. They're both AI ethics specialists. In particular, we have Alayna, who at IBM is an AI ethics researcher, and Will is the Chief Ethics Officer at Hypergiant. So both of you, welcome to our conversation today.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.
Alayna, let's start off with you. A lot of our discussion for our community at All Tech is Human is focused on the responsible tech pipeline. Both of you have really interesting positions in the AI ethics space, and then in particular, both of you involved with our recent release of the business case for AI ethics, which you can find if you go to businesscaseforaiethics.com. But I think there's a lot of curiosity about how people even get into this field of AI ethics. So love to learn more about your role at IBM and then how you actually got to where you are now.
Sure. Yeah. So thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and to chat about this. So the business case for AI ethics was actually something that David and I dreamed up a couple months ago and came out of a lot of my experiences at IBM. So I started at IBM just about 2 years ago, right out of college, and was really interested in looking at technology, policy, and AI ethics and safety. I had been involved in that a lot in college, and I was really interested in the community that was emerging around the topic. So I started getting involved. I started doing a couple of side projects within IBM, and ended up starting a small team with the help of some of my fantastic colleagues, and started doing a little bit of work within the business. But one of the things that we often came across, and this is the motivation behind the All Tech is Human business case for AI ethics, is that a lot of the language of the ethical community is in the academic space or in the policy governance space. And I really wanted to translate it into the ethical community. So in the past 2 years at IBM, I've worked with a little team and gotten involved in some of that work, specifically looking at how in industry we can start applying some of this stuff. Yeah, but I guess I should give a disclaimer. I'm not here as an official IBM representative. My thoughts are my own, so I'm not here for my employer. Just
your statements do not represent. I think it's 200,000 people across the globe. Yeah. So, Will, what about yourself? Again, I remember reading actually a couple articles. I think that's how we originally got in touch. One at Built In that was talking about your role as Hypergiant. Really, really fascinating. I know a lot of people in the All Tech is Human community are also really interested in your work. So, tell us a little bit about what you do at Hypergiant, and then specifically how you got into the AI ethics space. Oops. Yeah. Oh. No. Well, we'll actually go back to Alayna right now, since we'll get Will back on with his audio. A lot of conversation lately about Timnit Gebru, who is a very prominent AI ethics researcher at Google for their ethical AI space. And recently, there was a lot of brouhaha about her kind of forced resignation, if you will. And a lot of it seemed to stem around her pushing back on not being allowed to present some of the research that she was doing. So love to hear some of your thoughts about that situation, because it certainly has rocked the conversation for AI ethics.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it also has a specific significance for the business case specifically within industry. So one of the things that we have been thinking about a lot in this report and in the conversation leading up to it is, how do you address the tension that exists between a lot of academics and activists who do really great work and whose mission is sort of centered in activism, in advocacy, in thought leadership, and creating materials? How do you take that attitude and translate it into a business setting where the things that are important are, creating profit, delivering to clients, ultimately like growing the business and growing engagement with your business? Those are two completely separate sets of goals and principles. And there's nothing wrong with the industry wanting to grow their business, right? That's what businesses do. But there needs to be a translation to the goals that exist within business. And one of the things that we often find is that academics are really willing to start making that transition, but there is still a lot of tension, which I think is obviously evident in Timnit's firing, between corporations and the activists who want to critique them. Corporations don't do AI ethics perfectly, right? And there needs to be some level of conversation on, okay, we want to incorporate this into a business setting. We want to make this profitable for businesses. We really do want to integrate this into the system that already exists. But how are we going to make sure we protect people who are activists and academics and who don't fit super neatly into a corporate setting, right? Like, because if you completely translate AI ethics into a corporate setting, you get AI ethics washing, and this like sense of feel good corporate branding that doesn't actually do anything. So there's like this very fine line that you have to walk. Currently, there's a lot of pressure on, I think, people who work on AI ethics in industry to make sure that they're doing that. So obviously, Timnit's firing is devastating for the community, and sort of sets back this idea that ethics can happen in an industry setting. So if this had happened 2 weeks ago, I think the business case for AI ethics that you're reading would look a lot different.
Yes. And that's something I would like to kind of point out, is that what we released yesterday, and that we all worked on together and had 100 collaborators that kind of steamrolled right after our original discussion. It's just the first draft, and we're looking for that community involvement. So there's a lot of ideas, a lot of disagreement, which is good. We should be debating this. So do reach out, because we're trying to build this something a little more thorough for a March 2021 release. But Will, I see you're back. So I want to learn a little bit more about your work at Hypergiant, and then how you got into the space of AI ethics.
Well, so first of all, I want to say congratulations on the business case for ethics that you put together, and more importantly, about the thought leadership that you were able to convene to put in that document, because I think that's the path that we need to go forward. I think that's what actually makes it business, as opposed to just pure academic research. I think it gives you the opportunity to look at best practices, look at different roles, see the different points of view from different people. Well, my background is primarily as an entrepreneur. And so I started out in, kind of blue chip big companies, and then I went into small companies, and then now I'm kind of in a growing, emerging company. And so our CEO, Ben Lamb, I knew from a couple of ventures before that we were both investors in a company called TheBridge. But Ben said, well, I'm growing a new company with a bigger vision. Would you like to join? And the vision was to use AI to deliver on the future that was promised, which is the technology that adds to longevity for lifespan and improves medicine, that is, cars that are 100% carbon neutral. How do we make a more efficient, just, and a cleaner world? So I was attracted to that vision. And the role we settled on was ethics, because I feel like at the end of the day, Silicon Valley has not lived up to its role as a corporate citizen. Sorry, it's not just Silicon Valley, but corporations haven't. So I wanted to be a part of that. So that's kind of how I jumped into it.
Well, I have a good follow-up question, because we did receive a bunch of questions when people signed up originally for this event. And also, I want to prompt anybody who is watching and wants to participate. Just enter your comments, and we will see them on our end. And a bunch of those will be incorporated on screen in our live stream today. But Will, I'll start you off with this question that we received from Chloe Owen. She asked the question, do ethicists include civil society when discussing the case for ethical AI in business? What is the role of civil society? What's the role that civil society can play? So, Will, what's your thought on that? Because it seems like there's always a lot of natural tension between who are the different groups involved in this and how do they actually relate to one another?
I think our goal is to think of not just our client in the business case or the technical thing that we're trying to solve as our only constituency. So our model basically is based on Immanuel Kant, a deontological framework. It has three pieces. The first is, with this AI use case, is there goodwill? Is there a positive intent for the use case? So in most cases, yeah, it passes that test. The second is the categorical imperative, which is a maxim which says that if every company in our industry, every industry in the world used technology in this way, what would the world look like? That in turn gets to civil society. So that makes our constituency the entire world. It makes the stakeholders the entire world. So our designers and developers are not only looking at what impact does this have for Hypergiant, what impact does it have for the client, but what impact does it have for the entirety of the world? So that's the second step. The third step is the law of humanity, which is, are people being used as a means to an end in this use case, whether it's efficiency, profits, etc., or are people the primary beneficiaries of this use case? Those three obligations, the burden of proof is on the designers and the developers, who we call the use case owners. They have to make affirmative defenses as to why it is that they are ethical with this use case. The second stage in our process involves a red team, and those are the contrarians in our company. And they don't have a vested interest directly in that particular project or use case. And they come in and they raise objections across all three levers. So on goodwill, they can challenge that. But where most of the action happens is on the core of your question, which is civil society. Most of it happens, are there stakeholders that we did not consider? Are there constituencies that could be negatively impacted by this use case? What impact on society are we having with this use case? And so when those objections are raised, the burden of proof goes back to the use case owner to either modify the project to answer those objections, or explain and ethically justify why it is that the use case as originally intended answers those objections. Or in some cases, the ethics review board can come in and scrap the project altogether. So within our framework, we look at the entirety of humanity as a stakeholder. I feel like that's ultimately going to be the only way that you can really get ethics embedded into the workflows, because as we've seen, what happens with tech companies is they have a lot of unintended consequences. Mm-hmm. And their default position is, we could not have foreseen that, that privacy would have been invaded in social media the way it is, or we could not have foreseen that location-based data on phones would be used in the way that it has been. But within our framework, the burden of proof is on the designers and the developers to use their creative imaginations to imagine the impacts on stakeholders, even if that's not what the original use case was intended to solve or serve.
Well, let's get down, or actually, Alayna, did you have something to add on to that?
Yeah, I did. I just wanted to say, Will, that I want to emphasize that point about workflow and about integrating a lot of this work into the product development lifecycle, right? Which is sort of one of the biggest things that happens in industry, is things don't just appear out of nowhere. There's entire teams that are working on designing products, marketing products, creating products, and delivering them to clients ultimately. And ethical problems can arise in a lot of different parts of that product development lifecycle, from design to implementation to even the marketing and sales of that work. So it's really important to kind of emphasize that this happens across business units, and each business unit has its own language and tools that it uses, right? So you can't talk to somebody who's selling this work in the same way that you want to talk to somebody who's developing it. And so that's an important part of integrating this work into business, is that just like you can't use academic language broadly as and translate it into business, you also can't talk to a salesperson the same way you talk to somebody who's delivering. You need to have this make sense for them and focus on the elements of this product that will come within their purview. So you might want to talk about fairness metrics with the data scientist, but when you're talking to a seller, you need to talk about explainability, transparency at like a high level. So the language needs to change between what stakeholders within business you're talking to. Again, because the workflows go from design to deployment.
Well, let's get specifically into some concrete examples. I see a question from Monica that I'm going to bring up on screen. So Monica asks, how do we include the disabled community into the development of data sets and machine learning models? Most of the time, they have a problem with accessing information from inaccessible websites. And as a perfect example, I remember seeing a conversation recently at Data and Society where one of the speakers mentioned something we might not think about, even when you register for Eventbrite, how it has a limitation usually of like 10 minutes. Well, if somebody was having a slower time with filling that out, that would be inaccessible. So Will, I'll start you off with that question. So how do we actually involve these communities? And as Monica is asking, the disabled community, how can we actually involve them to incorporate this into the data sets?
So that's actually a question that we're grappling with real time. One of our designers is a guy named Mark Boudria, who has published a paper actually with the Penn State AI Society on this exact topic, which is to how do we create AI and emerging technology for what he calls the differently abled. And so in order to do that, it kind of gets back to our framework. That is a sensitive category constituency that each of our use cases has to answer. With the categorical imperative, will this use case impact the differently able? Now, in most cases, the designers and the developers will say, well, we didn't even think about it because they aren't going to be the end user of our use case. And then we push it back to them. The burden of proof is on them. That says the question still is, how will this impact with the differently able? So even if they're not the intended primary beneficiary or they're not the intended client, we still have to have a point of view on how it is that the differently able are going to be able to access and use the technology that's designed and developed at Hypergiant. So that's one. The second is there are companies out there like Abilify that you probably are aware of, that their whole goal is to go out and consult companies who are developing technology to help them understand the category that the groups that they're overlooking will interact with their technology, even if they don't think about it. So to Monica's point about them being completely shut out of the conversation, the first step is we have to imagine them as part of our constituency when we design and develop the technology. And then the second is we either need to go to them directly, go to their ombudsman, or go to their spokespersons or groups that actually represent their point of view in the use case. Mm-hmm. And the burden of proof is not on the differently able to come in and imagine what use cases we're working on. The burden of proof is on the developers and the designers to affirmatively state, even though our primary beneficiaries are X, Y, and Z, here is how it will impact the other sensitive groups and categories, and we thought of it. Now, a lot of people, getting back to workflow, when you first go in with ethics, and it depends on where the company is, and that's why I always think that if the CEO is not involved, and the board of directors doesn't make it a mandate for everyone who touches a use case to use your ethical vetting framework, then it's doomed to fail. I think Google is the perfect example of that. You have the ethicists who are over in one building and they don't agree. Mm-hmm. And then you have the decision makers and the designers and developers somewhere else. And those two actually never meet other than lunch and learns and whatever. They don't meet. To Alayna's point, in the workflow. Like they're not in the same production line. They're totally different ethics is not embedded into the workflow. So at our company, the CEO mandates it. So all developers and designers get trained on our framework. They should be able to vet on their own their role within the particular use case. But as part of that, you have to imagine the whole world as your constituency and all of the other protected groups within it.
Well, that's a question actually I see that just came in from Cynthia that I'll bring up on screen, and then Alayna, I'll have you tackle this question. It goes right to that point. Really good question here. Having a model to guide ethical product development is great. But how do we apply some notion of ethics to other aspects of a company and how it operates, such as the clients it works with, right? So that goes to your earlier point, Alayna, when you mentioned the concern a lot of people have around ethics washing or viewing this too much in a PR communication strategy, as opposed to actually impacting the ethical development and deployment of artificial intelligent technologies. So what do you say to a question like that about this potential disconnect between the people who might be tackling some of the ethical AI and not potentially getting the buy-in from leadership or a conflict with other departments?
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to note again that sort of the business case that we ended up writing is more for internal mechanisms of creating change. But in addition to that, there's an entire landscape and spectrum of ways to leverage power within organizations, within civil society, and within governments that are all also necessary. So something like this would be something that could be leveraged from outside of a company. So sort of before a company can be ethical, you do need to have leadership support and some level of governance framing, right? So to actually affect the way that business is done and businesses create different opportunities with clients, you can do that multiple different ways. So the argument of this paper that we published is, if you're inside a company, how can you translate to your managers and the people that you work for that this work is important? But then if you're asking questions about what if a client itself, like a defense agency, is considered unethical, that might be the work that's done by someone in civil society or governance, or someone who can create actual policy that influences that. Sort of the argument behind the business case for AI ethics is that companies want to do things that help grow their bottom line. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. That's sort of the structure that we've all agreed upon for how companies work, right? And if a client is sort of a really good client, they're offering them a lot of work. There needs to be some different leverages of power to make sure that that work is not unethical. So there's a limit to what you can do from inside a company in terms of what you can do. There's a lot you can do, and a lot of it is laid out in the paper that we published. But there is also a lot of outside work that needs to be done. So something like making sure that defense contractors and government agencies have a limit on what they can do is sort of more a governance perspective or a policy perspective, or something that civil society could comment on. Again, there's all of these different layers for where both horizontally, like across the process from design to deployment, but then also vertically, like where are you on that chain? Are you just a data scientist or a tech worker who doesn't get to decide what client they work on? Or are you working on policy and governance, right? So these are different questions that we need to ask both across the work that we're doing and what position you sit on and the things that you have the ability to control and influence.
And I know with our collaborators, right, building this business case for AI ethics, that was a heated discussion and actually a lot of disagreement around: do we focus on top down? Do we focus on bottom up? What's the need of the kind of responsible tech community at large that feeds this underlying knowledge base? But I'm also seeing a bunch of other questions. So even though I have a stack of great questions here, I really want to incorporate some of them. So I see that Alex is talking about: how can businesses effectively address ethical concerns late in the product development lifecycle, or after a large dependence on the underlying technology has already been solidified? So we're seeing this question come up a lot. Yes.
If you let me talk again, dude. Sorry to monopolize the time. But one of the things that we're working on at IBM, and I think is really important, is a continuous assessment of maturity and governance. So when you're looking at something like late in the life cycle stage, you need to have a governance framework that allows you to continuously improve and monitor projects. So ideally, in a perfect world, we would have ethically aligned design from the get-go. Something like this wouldn't happen. But what we need to have is we need governance metrics within industry that say, okay, well, we're going to make sure that our projects are sort of working across this ethical design across the spectrums. So having some way to say, okay, is this problematic? Like framing that in the way that we like to frame it is with a risk management perspective. So it sort of gets flagged at some point in the process saying, okay, this is kind of risky for our business. What do we do about it? then going back to a continuous maturity scale and saying, here's ways you can improve, get it back in the pipeline. Is it still being flagged by a risk assessment? If yes, put it back in again, see if you can improve it more. Is it still getting flagged by a risk assessment? No? Okay, let's move forward, right? So you need to have this continuous process of evaluating your projects for risk and then having some metrics through which you can improve them, and then bringing them back, assessing them again and saying, okay, this seems better, let's go ahead, right? It can't just be one stop down the road. This also is really important because a lot of projects continue for a really long time, right? It's not just like, I'm going to deliver you this nicely packaged thing. It's like, I'm going to continue to do work for you for a long time, right? So there needs to be this sense of continuous assessment and looking for, where is that risk? Okay, are we mitigating it? Let's assess it for risk again. So that's a really good question.
And that's actually a follow-up, and Will, I'll kick this over to you, and then I have another question from DC that I'm going to incorporate as well. I like how this individual apologizes for their username. No need to apologize. You can use whatever username you want as long as it's decently appropriate. But following up on Alex's question, additionally, do you see impactful attempts to reduce the asymmetry of information regarding AI ethics for civil society? And that's a big debate, right? Is that it seems like the information is not flowing equally around this. We oftentimes are very siloed with how we discuss this. So, Will, I'd like to hear a little bit more from you about that asymmetry, and then really how we can potentially work more with civil society, or have AI ethics researchers work more with civil society.
So asymmetry is the number one problem in the number one reason why tech is tearing society at the seams. Because in the perfect example of this is the implied consent debate. Everyone, when they download an app or get a social media program, they're agreeing to something. But they can't read all the boilerplate on all those documents that they give implied consent to. And so that's the reason why we're in the mess we're in now. And honestly, it wasn't until the Black Lives Matter protests and the Black Lives Matter protesters begin to point out facial recognition being used by the police force that the general public became aware of how law enforcement was using facial recognition. And it's ultimately that information, as it began to spread in civil society, that led to IBM pulling out of the business and Amazon and Microsoft in the moratorium. And so what has to happen is more work like Temnitz or Joy, the Algorithmic Justice League. More advocates need to come out and explain to the general public how it is that they're being impacted by technology that is completely invisible to them today. So if you use Netflix or if you use Amazon, you're interacting with AI, Siri, like even that basic discussion needs to happen. Like, your life is being controlled by AI today. So that education needs to happen on how it's being done. Your credit decisions are being made based on AI. When you apply for a job, AI is being used. That needs to be explained. The second step is that once it's explained, it needs to be steps need to be laid out to the general public on what can I do? How can I get involved if I don't like the way it's being used? I think the next major context that citizens will have an opportunity to make changes in the way AI is evolving is as more local municipalities move to quote unquote smart cities. As they make decisions on smart cities, now the electorate has an opportunity to put forward to the elected officials to say, hey, make the case to me for smart cities. How are you going to protect us in the case of smart cities? And I think a good example of that civic education happened in Toronto with Google's Sidewalk Labs project. Once the activists got involved and began explaining to the community how the waterfront was going to be developed and the impact that was going to have on their privacy and how it was essentially going to turn Toronto into a surveillance state, that got the activists active, that got the public active, and that ultimately led to them scrapping the project. And as you remember, that was the Sidewalk Labs is supposed to be the future of Google. That was supposed to be how it was that they were going to basically control almost every aspect of human life across geographic regions around the world. And once activists got involved, people decided they didn't want to live in a real life Truman Show. And that's the way that people get involved. But that education needs to happen at that level where people understand how they're interacting with AI, the rights that they're giving up in AI, the plans that are being made to deploy AI in more expansive ways, and then they need to be told ways that they can get involved. So it's going to be a huge process, but it's going to happen one way or another, because no matter whether we like it or not, we're starting to see in 2021 is going to only accelerate it. We're going to see more AI IEDs blowing up in different contexts from different use cases. And the more that happens, the more people are going to demand that policymakers get involved and regulate these companies.
Well, and I think your description of what you talked about, it's a good segue for this question I'm going to bring up. And it also reminds me of a great new movie that just came out that features a lot of those prominent researchers you mentioned, and that's called Coded Bias. If you go to codedbias.com. I'd also like to take this time to also thank our partner, TheBridge. Check them out at thebridgework.com. I should have mentioned that at the beginning. We're doing this as a regular live stream series with them. But let's bring in DC's question. So how do we address the likely exponential negative impact AI will have on lower income communities and communities of color, primarily access issues, right? Huge digital divide when we're talking about COVID right now, especially schools going remote. So Alayna, would you like to take that question, or Will, or whoever wants to jump in?
Yeah.
And I'll just kind of preface that with, as we're certainly seeing right now, it's such a heated debate around the people who usually develop and deploy these technologies oftentimes have dramatic differences, right? They're not the same as the individuals that are oftentimes the first people to use these technologies. And that's something that Cathy O'Neil, the author of Weapons of Math Destruction, pointed out quite clearly in that movie, Coded Bias. So Alayna, what are your thoughts on this particular issue?
Yeah, again, I would say that similar to some of the things that Cathy says in her documents, this involves continuous processes and continuous evaluation and development by tech companies. So they need to start actually looking at those numbers and looking at the demographics and seeing, where are we being fair? Are we harming communities? And like, what risks does that bring us and bring to our business? So I actually see, I don't want to like jump around too much, but there's another question in the chat that's also about, without regulation, what incentive will tech companies play? Like,
I'll bring that up. Sure.
Do this work, right? And I think that's really relevant to this specific question, because if there's no regulation, what incentive do they have? And there's actually a number of incentives. So working on a lot of, there have been some studies recently that show doing responsible design for tech from beginning to end of the life cycle development process actually enhances product quality. There's also the point that William brought up about enhanced regulation. You know, with increased scrutiny on this technology, not only is regulation likely to happen within the next few years that companies will need to be ready for, but there's also a huge shift in public opinion. So companies really hurt their brand, really hurt their ability to work within a regulatory marketplace by not paying attention to these things. So there's sort of there's like an academic activist answer to those questions, but there's also like a very real business incentive to not cause harm to communities, both through branding, through prospective regulation. Another really big one is employee retention. Like as we're seeing at Google, especially with the fallout after Timnit's firing, a lot of young tech workers care about this a lot and don't want to work for companies that are just doing the ethics washing and are found to be irresponsible and not doing anything about it. There's more detailed in the report that we put out, but there actually are a number of very real and concrete business incentives to do this work that lead to increased growth, better brands, employee retention, and real things that businesses should be caring about.
Okay. Yeah, and that's
the fact that it's just clearly the right thing to do.
Yeah, and that seems to be the common thread line is how do we balance the actual right thing to do and what is lined up with the business incentive? Does it have to be good for business? I saw a comment from Cheryl Kababa from Substantial, the company Substantial, in our business case for AI ethics. One of the folks interviewed, and she kind of pointed out, hey, she doesn't think that it should even need to be a business case. It's just the right thing to do. But Will, I'm going to give you that question because one of the things that we are noticing looking through all these great interviews, yourself included, was that people oftentimes fell into different camps, right? They either fell into, hey, this is all about risk mitigation, and the more risk we mitigate, the more profitable the company is. That's camp A. Camp B could be about, hey, consumers really are going to value this either now or in the future. Therefore, this is a value add. Therefore, that's more profitable. So that's option B. And option C would say, hey, right now we've got bigger fish to fry because this is all about capitalism until we solve the underlying systemic issues that affect how we derive and create products based on maximizing kind of wealth, then a lot of these issues are going to be difficult to solve. So Will, out of those kind of three options, where would you say that your focus tends to fall under?
Well, let me just say my background is as an entrepreneur. Taking risk, reaping the reward, that's really what motivates me. That's how I move. And so I think ethics is central to that. And kind of our tagline is ethics equals trust. And it's the trust that leads to the economic value creation. That's how you get partners. That's how you get clients. That's how you keep and retain customers, because of the trust. So we start with that. That's crucial to what we do. The second thing is when we talk to designers and developers, we explain to them how this is going to make you more creative. So here's kind of how our workflow process works. RFP comes in, or a statement of work comes in for a client, and they have a business and tech solution they want to solve. So that's step one. Then our designers and developers and R&D get together and they create a menu of potential solutions. Then ethics, we go in and we vet all those potential solutions based on ethics. And then if there are objections, it goes back to the team and they either have to modify that use case or justify the position that they took. In most cases, that results in them creating more solutions, because it makes them more creative. So when people talk about the underrepresented groups or the minority groups or the differently abled groups, now I'm thinking about more constituencies. That should make me more creative, because now I come up with more solutions. And what we find is that we have more solutions come after the ethical vetting to a particular tech problem than we had beforehand. So I'll give you an example. We had a client who's the world's largest largest builder of railway cars. One of the things they developed is automated people movers for some of the largest airports around the world. Well, and then they also do transit systems, train systems, and metro and subway systems. Now, when communities pass bonds for those transportation projects, what are those projects really? Those big infrastructure projects? They're jobs programs. So what our client wanted was a predictive maintenance robot process automation solution. But the solution that we came up with at first would have cut jobs. Well, that's bad for business. It's not only bad ethically, but it's bad for business because it undercuts the reason why those programs were even funded in those jurisdictions in the first place. And it took ethics to point that out to our designers and developers. Once we pointed that out, then they came up with human machine teaming apps where the humans worked with the AI in order to deliver a predictive maintenance solution. But that's a case where we would have had our client going back to a client with a solution that actually would have destroyed their business, because the only reason why those projects are funded is as jobs programs. So there's no way that we could present to them an efficiency maximizing economic solution that did not actually solve the problem that was being presented by the use case. That's not a singular example. There are literally, because of the interconnected nature of the world, especially anyone that deals with public projects or any projects involving the public sector, which is still over a quarter of all the purchasing around the world comes from the public sector. And then smart cities is going to be 100% public sector. So it's important for you to understand the ethical goals of communities and the ethical goals of any of those entities before you even try to design a solution, because you could think that you have a maximum efficiency solution that is actually bad for you economically. And so that's the reason why it's easy for us to make the business case for ethics, because ethics at the center will equal the trust, and it's the trust that leads to the economic value creation.
Good. Well, I'm seeing a bunch of questions come in here. I see 3 in our pipeline. So we'll probably get to those, and then we'll start closing it up, finding more ways that we can stay in touch with all of you as we build on this business case. So let's look at this one, and then Alayna, I'll give that over to you. I know metrics has been an area that you've done a lot of focus on. So asking for some for us to elaborate on this enhanced product quality, the specific metrics we can explore.
Yeah. So again, making sure that this is something that we can measure, repeat, and put within a process that we can sort of score is really important to do. William's example was really great, right? That when we're talking about enhanced product quality, by having ethically aligned design where we consider a lot of different users, we come up with more solutions. And businesses often really care about this, right? If you come to a business and you say, we're going to make sure that your product is accessible for everyone, takes into account all of these ethically aligned principles, and we're going to make sure that something like the PR disasters of Facebook and Cambridge Analytica doesn't happen to you. Clients want to see that, right? It leads to better outcomes. And often there's these, within the scope of machine learning, there's been this sort of driver towards efficiency or numbers or accuracy. And what we're starting to realize now is that machine learning systems and AI in general fits within a social context. And to really realize its entire value, we need to figure out what the social context is for it. So we need to figure out the entire spectrum of what our customers want, make sure we can deliver to that, sort of like William's example, while giving them a creative solution that helps them and doesn't actually hurt their business. It requires a lot of creativity, right? And it's more than just saying we're going to create a system that's like 95% accurate. It's saying we're going to create a system that is accurate, but we're being very conscious to make sure it's not biased. It doesn't have some like statistical errors thrown into it, right? Because you can have an accurate system that is not accurate for people who are differently abled, people of color. If you have a data set that's like 99% white people and you're like, oh, it's 99% accurate for all the white people, it's not actually accurate, right? You're just focusing on that one metric. So by moving away from that just one metric thinking, we can start thinking more about like qualitative metrics of customer experience, client satisfaction, and how creating more ethically aligned design, ethical AI systems where we're continuously assessing the maturity of them, the risk that they present to clients and ultimate end customers. By doing this, we actually create better business.
Well, that's the next question I'm going to bring in. I know it's a heavily debated question, but I'll send it over your way. As a consumer, this is a question from Nick. As a consumer, are there any ways or tips that you can provide in evaluating or comparing the ethics of a company, comparing company A to company B beyond maybe Glassdoor employee reviews, reading the terms of service, and reading the fine print? I know this is a heavily debated area. I even just, I think, received a tweet on that recently because it's very hard to rank companies because a lot of these major tech companies are so large that they're involved in so many different spaces. I know specifically there's always a lot of debate around tech companies and involvements with ICE and other types of types of military involvement as well. But I will love to hear your opinion on that. Is there any way that we can classify, here's an ethical company, here's less of an ethical company, especially for a lot of people that are looking to work for these companies, right? They want to work for a company that they're also proud of.
So, Nick, that's a great question. Right now, because of the issue we talked about above, the information asymmetry, it's very difficult for the consumers to evaluate how they're being in touch with AI and how those companies are deploying AI. But one of the things that was just launched, which is a combination of the World Economic Forum, AI Global, the Schwartz-Reisman Institute for Technology and Society, IBM's involved, OpenAI, Oxford Internet Institute, Data Nutrition Project, University of Toronto. I think we had our first working group yesterday, which is to create a responsible AI certification mark for A, companies, and B, for use cases. In products and services. So the World Economic Forum, among others, is very well aware of this issue of information asymmetry. And so the experts who are concerned about ethics are getting together now to start to create a certification mark, essentially a good housekeeping seal of approval mark for companies that are deploying AI and specific products and services that are being deployed. So great question, Nick. That's the biggest, the biggest issue. And now I think a lot of those people are involved with David, like some of the brightest minds who are focused on ethics and who really care about it, who understand the underlying tech, how it works, and understand the players are working on that exact issue. So I believe by the middle of 2021, and it'll hit probably around the same time that we start seeing a rush of legislation coming out of AI, they'll probably hit at the same time. There'll be new legislation regulating companies along with these industry conventions and these certification marks where you get certified on a certain scale for responsible AI.
Wonderful. I think our final question, then we're going to have to wrap things up. I know we could continue talking about this for hours and hours on end, but if that's something that you're into, please reach out our way at alltechishuman.org. We're going to continue the conversation. We recently started a Slack group for these types of conversations for the responsible tech community. We'd love to have you join us. But the final question, good question about education, specifically for our younger audience. This is impacting, and this is the question that Brad's asking. AI is impacting children and their present and future world before they can make decisions. What can K through 12 teachers do to make students aware, intro AI ethics, and amplify students' voices into these businesses, right? So kids are being impacted. They're not sitting at the boardroom table, right? So Alayna, any thoughts on that about increasing this education for a younger demographic?
Yeah, so there's actually, I'm not the expert on this, but there are a ton of organizations doing this work. One I've worked with is Ethical CS, which is specifically focused on getting ethical computer science education into K-12 schools. So check them out. There's definitely a ton more. So like this is an area where civil society and organizations play a huge role. There are a lot of people who are working on this. So I would just sort of make space for those voices, because I'm not the expert on this, but go check out some of the people who are doing this work.
Okay. Wonderful.
And then MIT has an AI and ethics curriculum for middle schoolers. So if you go to the MIT Media Lab, it's a great set of work. It's a great set of it's a small curriculum that'll allow you to do ethics exercises with middle schoolers, and it's specific to AI. So it's called the Ethics Curriculum for Middle School, and it's available for free at the MIT Media Lab. I strongly recommend it. I think it's great.
And that's a good segue to mention that if you're hearing a lot of great resources that we're mentioning today, our partners at the Radical AI podcast, they curate these resources and then put our live stream into a podcast that's going to be released in the coming days. So check that out and then take these action items and curated resources. But love to stay in touch with all of you and start building this community. So as we kind of wrap it up, and Will, I'll start with you here. How can people stay in touch with some of the great work that you're doing? Is there, do you have a Twitter handle or something that you recommend people reaching out your way?
So Will Griffin on LinkedIn. If you do Will Griffin at Hypergiant, you'll find me. And then Will Griffin 1 of 1 on Twitter.
Well, I appreciate you offering kind of your experience and expertise today. And then Alayna, I'd love to hear from you about where people can stay in touch.
Yeah, so you can follow me on Twitter at Alayna Kennedy, Alayna _Kennedy. You can just look me up. My name is pretty unique. Feel free to connect on LinkedIn and check out some of the work. So IBM has an AI ethics board that is publishing some work externally. That would be a great place to go to figure out like what we're doing. They're fantastic and putting a lot of great work into this. But yeah, other than that, I think that's probably the best way to find out more.
Well, again, I appreciate both of you coming on today's discussion. I know it's an evolving debate. So we have Alayna Kennedy from IBM, and then also Will Griffin from Hypergiant. So thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in and all your great discussions. Stay in touch with us. Again, as a reminder, I'm David Ryan Polgar. I run the organization called All Tech is Human. Check us out at alltechishuman.org. Also, check out our partners at TheBridge. You can find them at thebridgework.com, and our partners, the Radical AI podcast, which are going to be sending out a follow-up podcast with this, along with curated resources. So Alayna, Will, everyone watching, thank you.
Thank you, David.
David.
Take care.
Bye.